So welcome to Sunday program. Welcome to the monastery if you've never been here before. We're very happy to have you. We just finished a weekend retreat on the Inner Critic, and I'm going to talk about the Inner Critic some today and maybe how you could work with it. It's such a pernicious force in the mind. It's such a pernicious force in human beings that we could have spent a month, we could do a month-long Inner Critic retreat and it would be worth I see some nods. It would be worth all of the hullabaloo to put that together and do it, because the Inner Critic is this force of pain that is to a great degree optional. It's a force of pain that through practice, and it may very well be reduced through Zen practice alone, though we are bringing in other methods, but through some kind of awareness, the Inner Critic can become something very little in your life or transformed altogether. Now I have something I call the Inner Critic 4-step alchemy. And I just think the word alchemy is really cool, so I try to say it as often as possible. I don't really know what it means, but it makes something sound a little cooler. The alchemy of the Inner Critic. So I have some ideas and practices to share with you about it. In some ways, it's a summary for those who are at the retreat. But first thing to say is, as far as transformation is concerned, there are really 3 elements. Or at least as far as I'm concerned about transformation, there are 3 elements. Okay? So the first is understanding. And we can get understanding from a talk, from our own experience. We can get understanding from reading. Okay? So we read about the Dharma and we understand the path. Or we hear a Dharma talk and we begin to understand the mind more. So that's understanding. But understanding is not sufficient to liberate. Now, once in a while it is. Once in a while a kind of understanding just shapes our perspective. We see things differently, and all of a sudden we find that we are being differently. They're not impossible, but generally, understanding needs a method. Okay? So, the Buddha says, your mind is crazy. You could do something about that. You say, what can I do? The Buddha says, here's something you could do. That's method. It's a means of working with the crazy that the Buddha helps us see. But that's not it either, because we have to find a deep motivation to stop suffering. Without that motivation, methods and understanding, well, frankly, we'll give them up before they really penetrate, before they really permeate and do their work. So that last element I call love. That love can come from outside, like coming to a place like this meets part of the conditions of that love. That love also has to come from the inside. We have to, as you've heard me say, we have to no longer consent to being involved in our own suffering. Right? And then you could call that love, you could call that respect, if love is a little too fuzzy for you. So the Inner Critic, in order to maybe touch some of that love, which rises out of pain often, I'll invite you into just a little bit of reflection about the Inner Critic and the outer judge. Let's just say that's just 2 sides of the same coin for now. Okay? That part that criticizes other people or whatever. Let your mind just roam through your life. We don't have a lot of time for this, but think about beginning with your relationships how the inner critic has brought pain or difficulty into your relationships. The inner critic coming out of our mouth can close someone else down. The inner critic coming out of someone else's mouth can close our heart down. With the inner critic, a beautiful person, and I mean beauty in the broadest sense, the inner critic can fixate on one thing that it believes is wrong, and all that beauty recedes from view. Just think of the ways that the inner critic may have compromised or affected relationship. Think about the inner critic in your work life, livelihood, career aspirations. And some people may have found that their whole fuel was the dirty fuel of the inner critic. And yet it got them to some place that they're happy to be at. Some people may find that the inner critic has prevented them from taking a step that something else in them says, take that step. But the critic says, nah, you couldn't do that. Mm-mm. Workplace conflicts. Yeah. Sometimes the great job shifts to the job. And that was a job done by the inner critic. Think about your just general enjoyment of life. The inner critic's role in the basic pleasures or basic nourishments. Has it shown up there? Does it show up there? Think about your meditation this morning. Was the inner critic there? Good. I saw someone go, no. Good. Good. There might be some zones, some inner critic free zones. It's lovely when that happens. But it's also possible for it to be so pervasive there's nowhere. It's like one of those vines that just creeps over everything. It's an invasive species, we could say. So if you feel, whatever you feel, that is your motivation to really do something about it. As an abstract, as a concept that, there's this thing called the inner critic and I could be free of it, that only has so much power. But when we touch into the pain it causes, could be motivating. So on to the inner critic 4-step alchemy that's been trademarked. So the first is we learn to recognize it. Now this is probably a pretty psychologically savvy group of people, so you're like, yeah, I know exactly what you mean when you say the inner critic. But sometimes we just think, that's me. I'm so identified with the inner critic, a sense of the place I'm looking from is the inner critic. I look from the place of the inner critic so often, inner critic is off the map, it's just me. And what do I see? I see bad things. I see flaws. I see what's wrong, basically. So to learn to recognize it, to get it on the radar of awareness, to begin to tease it out from the other kinds of things that are moving through mind. Yeah? So recognition is important, and it actually has more and more subtlety. So we could say the first level is recognize it as a thought voice. For many people, the inner critic speaks. How does it speak to you? How can you recognize its presence? There's a lot of absolutist language that it likes. You might find, like, the critic tends to speak like you always, or you should, or you never. What's another one? You could have, when it's related to the past, yeah.
Ought to.
You ought to. Mm-hmm. You might recognize that it sounds like a family member or an authority figure from when you were younger. That can help because it brings in a little bit of the Buddhist insight of not self. This is conditioning. This was imprinted in me. Really, the mind is an open system. The division between inner and outer is mostly our fantasy, especially if you're a child. And so, now, one thing I'm cautious about is like, oh, those parents who made our life so bad. That, I think, is a mistake. It's pretty hard to be a parent. Nobody can do it perfectly. But sometimes a parent ends up in our mind, continues on. Noticing that could be helpful. Yeah, it might actually sound like Grandma Jane or whoever. So it can show up as a mental formation, to use Buddhist parlance, right? But there's an emotional tone as well. Because, so I learned that I could have a mind that was really clear, maybe empty-ish from this practice, but the inner critic would then show up as a feeling tone. Yeah, like it could, for me, it used to be like a bad mood, a kind of grumpy weather. I didn't hear it, but I felt it. It was a tone of negativity, the kind of the atmosphere of something is wrong. That's where it showed up there. It's an emotional tone. Related, a bodily contraction. You might recognize. For example, let's say you believe that a certain group of people are critical of you. And I say that because probably you're not psychic. And lots of times we believe people are critical of us and we don't really know, but say they are. In the presence of those people, you might find that your body tightens in a particular way. For example, even if you're not hearing oh yeah, they're right, they see right through you, or whatever it might be, it's expressed by your body. Yeah. Now, if I'm in a full-blown critic, or if I'm experiencing a full-blown critic, these are all usually going on at once. Yeah? Think of what happens to your face if you're in the critic. If you were just to like catch yourself in the mirror without changing your face, you might notice, oh, the inner critic makes a particular face. A little bit sour, a little bit frowny generally. Sometimes critics smile. There are like diabolical critics. That's beyond the scope of this talk. So you recognize how it shows up in body and mind. Those, in a way, are derivative of the inner critic as a way of seeing. More fundamental than the thoughts, the feelings, the articulations of your body. It's arising out of a perspective that is now animating you. It's a lens, it's a stance, the critic. Right? We all know that the critic is merely a perspective. You go out to a meal that's fabulous and your friends in the critic and all they complain about is the potatoes. The rest of it is fabulous. And you can see, oh, the critic sees this as lacking. The critic is now looking at this meal. It's a whole orientation towards reality. Unfortunately, the problem with identity is it's all-consuming. In the moment of being in the critic, if you don't know you are, you don't know you are. It presents itself as a truth, doesn't it? The inner critic doesn't go, you're terrible, maybe. I mean, you could be terrible. It rarely even asks for confirmation unless it knows other people will agree with us. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been in the critic and just you're feeling terrible about yourself, and someone who might actually challenge that view, you might avoid them. The critic doesn't want to be challenged. Negativity itself, from the Buddha's point of view, is just a coloration of perception. It's not reality. Reality has neither positivity nor negativity. Life has its textures. True, you prefer one thing over another. That's different than negativity, right? So, to recognize it as a way of seeing. And that's an ongoing work, right? That's something just to include in the general practice of being aware as a spiritual practitioner. It's another thing to be aware of and to include. So then we begin to recognize it. The next step is to embrace it. By embrace, what do I mean? The reason this is important is because you can't work with that which you suppress. Okay? It's an interesting thing. In some ways, when we sit down to meditate, there are times we are consciously suppressing. If you go into the suttas, the Buddha talks about suppressing the 5 hindrances. You basically put them aside. The hindrances of doubt and wanting to go to sleep and wanting a brownie and all of that. You put them aside so that you can actually let meditation do what it could do. It's a little bit like holding a ball underwater. This is one of my favorite images for this. You hold that ball underwater and you can have a nice swim. But eventually you have to let go of that ball, and no matter how long you've been holding it, it pops right up. The whole time you were meditating, you weren't working with that ball you were holding under. So it's an inclusion of the critic as something I need to work with. Further, this is not a bad thing that I have it. This is not a character flaw. It's nature, actually. This is not unspiritual. This is not the end of the world. This is, I would guess, just comes with having a body-mind and being a social creature. There's an inner critic to one degree or another. So accepting its presence. In the Buddha's mythology of awakening, we could read it as the Buddha making space for recognizing, applying my 4-step alchemy. The Buddha did. So the story of the Buddha's awakening is, this is a person who gave 101% to the spiritual path, right? And had to keep finding new teachers because nobody could meet his level of understanding, and yet was not fully free, and gathered great determination. There was a climax to Buddha's spiritual quest. And at the end of a long evening of deep practice, before things were about to really drop away, all the vestiges, the remaining remnants of delusion were going to fall away, the Buddha was met with the inner critic. Right? And you call it Mara in the tradition. Mara came, and I paraphrase. I haven't read it for a while, so I apologize if I'm not doing it justice, but Mara's like, you're not all that, Buddha. What makes you think you can be the fully enlightened one? You still like sex. And then Mara conjured all these girls and dancing beings, and the Buddha was like, nah. You're not all that. You still think you're still full of pride. And the Buddha said, no. Okay, you're still afraid, etc. And brought up all these reasons, basically zero in on the Buddha's potential weaknesses as a practitioner. And the Buddha just said, I recognize you. I see what you are. Hello, Mara. That's the first part's work. Maybe. And that recognition, he could have just gone into some samadhi where his mind was just utterly clear light, but he didn't. Right? That's kind of an important, subtle point. This being didn't need to have could go into the nothingness state like that. No, instead, met this force. And maybe it doesn't even come through, but maybe he met this force with love. It doesn't really come through in the language of the suttas, but I like to think that. So embracing. Then the third aspect is to separate. Now that is the language of voice dialogue, a parts work modality that I have training in. You separate from the inner critic. That means you're not so entangled with it as who you are. It begins to arise as a phenomena in your awareness, more and more distinct from that which is aware. All the non-dualists can just chill for now. It arises as distinct from that which is aware. It arises in a space of awareness that is uninvolved enough to freely see. That's a way to talk about what we're doing. The tool of meditation is to create an uninvolved, yet not passive space of awareness. And then we begin to experience the critic not as a thing, but as a composite. We begin to tease it apart. It arises as a thought, no more, no less. It's much less sticky. It arises as a bodily contraction, no more, no less. As a mood, as the way of seeing, etc. So we not only have separated or teased out our wakefulness from the critic, but the critic itself starts to come apart in the light of awareness. Its thingness begins to melt. Did you chant the Heart Sutra this morning? We start to do what the Heart Sutra is talking about. We start to, just through the inborn wisdom of wakefulness, we start to melt the solidity. It's a very different experience. It's like watching television, and all of a sudden, somehow you recognize, oh, this is just a bunch of pixels. I was very involved with this thing. In fact, it's amazing to me. This personal story is how long I've done this practice, that like a scary scene in a movie can make my body go into a panic mode. That's wild. Right? Something in us does not know the difference between that and reality. But we can have the experience, and we will if we continue, of seeing the pixels. Oh, this is just made of light, actually. That's a true statement. The inner critic it's more true to say the inner critic is made of light than almost anything else. It's like a hologram. It's a mean hologram often, but it's like a hologram. It's not substantial. In some ways, a lower hanging fruit than that kind of realization is just to simply observe impermanence. This is such a fundamental and constant Buddhist teaching that it's the kind of thing where you stop hearing it and you stop valuing it. You can become, what's the word, inured to it? Did I pronounce that correctly? I don't know. You can become inured to the teachings on impermanence and go, oh yeah, that's not very deep. Everything changes. But in the midst of a flurry of inner critic, you just watch that this is a thing that's just changing. Like everything else, it has the nature of coming into existence, doing a dance, and fading away. If you don't engage it, it's likely to subside before too long. There is something, I think, very personal to investigate about how even with negativity we feed it with our attention. And why that is. Why would we want to sustain the inner critic with our engagement? It's kind of weird. If we don't sustain it, it just comes into being, it exists, it does its dance, and it fades. It's like a swell. It may swell again, but that simple wisdom of impermanence somehow lightens the experience. It's just a wave. The last aspect, and these aren't really in order, but we have to work with linear time, is we sip the nectar, meaning there is value in the inner critic. Now, you could read some of the teachings from the Dharma as saying that the inner critic, in its essence, is something called mirror-like wisdom. There are the 5 Buddha families. There are these different qualities of awakened heart. And one of them is mirror-like wisdom. An intimate awareness of reality, meaning this, whatever this is for you, without any distortion. That it's possible to drop away. There is something in us that experiences free from our conditioning, free from our biases, free from who we think we are and what we think other things are. We could say it experiences utterly fresh, but lucidly at the same time. A bird sings, and without the thought, oh, that's a such and such, it's known. You know what it is, but not through your brain. The teachings talk about anger, which is related to the inner critic, anger as being the distorted expression of that mirror-like wisdom. The quality of anger, it's so sharp, isn't it? It points at something. Yeah? Anger is pointing at you, it's pointing at something in the culture, at a person, at an event, at an object. Anger is a sharpness that points. But what would happen if the pointing dropped away and you were just with the essence of it? So this is why it wouldn't actually be good to just suppress the inner critic for the rest of your life. The opportunity for this quality of lucid criticness would be lost. But on another level, we could see that often the critic is like a protector of our values. You know? It's like an unskillful, crabby friend. I know some of you have inner critics that are worse than an unskillful, crabby friend, but in some ways it's like an unskillful, crabby ally who, instead of saying, remember, you really care about being kind to people, says, you said something rude. You always do that. So you decode the criticism. You listen for, well, what? And this depends, it depends on these previous steps of having enough acceptance, space, recognition to do that. You listen and go, well, what is this really about? Oh, I care about this particular way of being or doing this particular thing. Now, you have to do something with that information after you retrieve it. So let's say you realize, I really care about skillful speech. My critic is telling me, I don't like it when I hurt people's feelings by letting something just come out of my mouth belligerently. If you don't work on that value that the critic is pointing out, it will continue to do its job. In other words, the opportunity is to cut to the chase. The critic can mellow out. Some people's critics are there, it seems, to help them fulfill their potential. I talked about last night about there's a Greek idea called the daimon. And this idea was that a person is born with a kind of, let's call it an internal presence. Could be external, I don't know. Born with a presence that's there to do whatever it takes to make sure someone fulfills some sort of potential or task. Could be your critic. It could just be a real rough ally. You could put it out of business. You might be able, from consciousness, to do a better job than the critic is doing, at least a less painful job. We can also see, and this is in itself a whole topic, we can see that the critic often is protecting our vulnerabilities. Yeah. It's aware of them. It would like us to not come apart, not be just totally overwhelmed by life's difficulties, by our pain. And so sometimes the critic is trying to basically a forceful way of managing our sensitivities. So it says, don't do that, really don't do that, you almost did that, whatever it may be. It's similar to the previous thing about the values. If we don't have a practice, a habit of being, of the energy of love and acceptance, then something like the critic will step in and do that. You know? That's why you can really undermine the critic simply through love. Not quickly, but over time. Starting to soak our being through with kindness. It's a little bit like a crab. Yeah? I was using the word crab, but I didn't think the symbolism of that is useful because a crab is very tender inside. And in order to protect that tenderness, because we all want to eat that tenderness, the world wants to eat our tenderness. There's this hard shell and these pinchers. It's a little bit like that. So my deep confidence is that even the gnarliest inner critic, will it go away completely? Probably not. Can you really shift your relationship to it, where there's more space, where it arises with understanding, where it's not the dominant state of mind? Absolutely. Absolutely. And the formula: love, understanding, method. All three of those. Thank you.